All right, very good morning to everyone. So glad to have you with us this morning in Market Street Church of Christ here in the auditorium for our Bible study. We are in the book of Genesis, the book of beginnings. If you want to open your Bible to Genesis chapter 29, that's where we'll pick up this morning. We are going through the book of Genesis just in one quarter, 13 weeks, and it is really difficult to try to cover 50 chapters and so many wonderful stories and so much information. That's why we decided to focus more on what we call the beginning. The book of Genesis is a book of beginnings, and so it is the beginning of everything in chapters 1 and 2. It's where sin begins in chapter 3. In chapter 4, whenever Cain and his family are sent out, it's the beginning of what is known as civilization. Then God destroys the world, and we have a new beginning in chapter 6 through 11. And then there's a new covenant, the beginning of this new covenant whenever God speaks to Abraham. And then that leads into bitter rivals, of which we see today, even all these many years later. And then we got into the beginning of the chosen family, where we start to see the family of Abraham develop. And then last week we started into the beginning of descendants, and we didn't make it all the way through. Probably not going to make it all the way through this morning, but we're going to try. And then chapters 32 through 36, which is what's going to lead in, as we're talking about this morning, the beginning of the nation of Israel. And then the next time we'll be talking about the beginning of a plan, and that is what God is doing to use Joseph in Egypt and how that plays into the history and story of Israel. And then we also see the beginning of Israel's time in Egypt in chapters 42. So you can divide the book of Genesis into these sections, each having to do with the beginning of this, the beginning of that, each one having its chapters. Again, it's a lot to cover in just one quarter, so we're doing more of an overview, which is really challenging for me, those of you who know me, because I like to go verse by verse, and there's just not enough time to do all that. So this morning we're going to be picking up where I left off last week, which is still the previous one. And so this is going to work out well because we do have some time that's built in there for if we need to. And in a couple of weeks, Brother Chris Davis is going to be filling in for me. And he'll get us all caught up, right, Chris? And then some, that's right. All right, so we are in this section where we're talking about the beginning of the descendants of Israel, of Jacob, which then is the beginning of Israel. All of this has to do with the life of Jacob, as you can see from this outline that we use. And here's what we've been looking at in this section with the beginning of descendants. We started out with the death of Abraham, and then it listed his descendants. We looked at that, and then the story of Isaac and Abimelech, and then how Isaac blessed Jacob and all the deception that is there, which is what the name Jacob means, a deceiver. And then we see that blessing now brings us up to chapters 28 and 29, where Jacob and Laban are dealing with each other. And then now we're going to get into where Jacob marries Leah and Rachel. And then we'll get into the children, and then Jacob fleeing Laban. And then we'll go into that next section, which will be coming up soon. All right. So in chapter 29, so we're going to pick up verse 1. You have kind of an idea, those who are joining us for the first time or coming back in, now you kind of have an idea of where we are. So Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the east. Just to bring you up to speed, you might remember that Sarah sent Isaac back to her people up in the land of Haran to take a wife. And so that's where he meets Rebekah, which is his family. And then Rebekah, well, actually, he sent a servant up there, and the servant brought Rebekah back to Isaac, and then that's who Isaac marries. Now, Rebekah is telling Jacob to go to their family and take a wife from among them. I know that sounds a little weird, sounds a little bit Arkansas style, but that is not the way that it was back then, all right? I'm glad some people got that reference. Sorry. Anyway, back then this was part of the culture, still is part of the culture in some Middle Eastern cultures. So going back to the family. So that's what's happening. Jacob's gone back to where his people are, the land of Rebekah's people. And he looked and saw a well in the field, and behold, there were 3 flocks of sheep lying by it. For out of that well they watered the flocks. A large stone was on the well's mouth. So then in verse 4, Jacob sees some men and says, "Where are you from?" And they said, "We are from Haran." Now, this is interesting because whenever we want to go on a trip or when we want to go somewhere, especially if we're traveling by land to get there, there's usually a road map that we will use. Nowadays we have GPS on our phones, or if anything, once you go down the road, even if somebody says, "Go down this road until you get to such and such, take this road and then you'll get there." There weren't signs when you roll into Haran, "Welcome to Haran," or anything like that. So the only way you're going to know is by talking to people. So he asked, "Who are you?" And they acknowledge who they are, where they're from, and lets Jacob know, okay, he's made it to the destination that he wants to get to. And then he says, "Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor?" And they said, "Indeed we do." So that's who he's looking for. He's looking for his uncle. He's looking for his family here. And now he has found them. So they said, or he said, "Is he well?" Verse 6. And they said, "He is well. And look, his daughter Rachel is coming from the sheep." Now, I don't know if this is exactly what's going on here, but notice what happens next. Then he said, "Look, it's still high day. It's not time for the cattle to be gathered. Water the sheep and go feed them." But they said, "We cannot until the flocks are gathered together," and they rolled the stone from the well's mouth. In my mind, and because I always look at things kind of like a movie or something, it's like he says, "Okay, who are you guys?" They say, "We're so-and-so. Where are you from?" "From Haran." "Oh, okay, so I'm in Haran." "Do you know Laban?" "Yes. In fact, there comes his daughter." Now, what did Jacob go to this area for? To find a wife. So immediately, here comes this woman. And as we're going to see later, very nice looking woman. It could be possible that now Jacob is saying, "All right, you fellas, go on, get out of here. I want my time alone with her." And they're like, "Well, what do you mean? We got to water our flocks." At least that's how my mind works. So Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess, verse 9. Then Jacob, verse 11, kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice and wept. Now, some of you might be thinking, "Wow, man, that was quick." You know, whenever I saw Andrea for the first time, I was smitten and I just jumped out and kissed her. Right? It's not how we do things, right? And by the way, that didn't happen. She wouldn't allow that. But in this case, this is a case of culture. It's no different than the first time that I experienced this when we moved to Paraguay. In Paraguay, the culture down there is the men and the women kiss each other, and the women kiss each other. The men, thank goodness, just shake hands when they meet each other. So whenever you go into a room, a man or a woman walks up to another woman if they're in the room and says, "Hi, how are you?" And you put your hand on their shoulder or just lean in and you, both sides of the cheek. You don't even actually have to touch. You just kind of make the sound and do this. And you got to be careful because there's some little old ladies will be like, and you got to back way up and come around. And then the other interesting thing about that is everybody loves their greetings. Even in texting, you don't just text somebody, "Hey, when are you going to be here?" You got to text and go, "Hey, how are you? Everything good? When are you going to be here?" When you're in a Bible study and everybody's in there, "Okay, open your Bibles to Genesis. We're going to read this." Then somebody comes in, you got to stop because they got to go around the room. All the way around the room. It's like, okay, good. All right, so picking up right here, then here comes somebody else. You got to go around the room. Then it takes a while to get things going because everybody's got to greet everybody with the kisses. So that's the kind of kiss, and the way we know that is we see that down in verse 13. When it came to pass, when Laban heard the report about Jacob, his sister's son, he ran to meet him, embraced him, and kissed him. There's that cultural kiss. And now in Argentina, the men do kiss. They put their hand around the back of your neck and they do the little blow kiss thing on the side. It's real awkward. And so Laban said to him, surely you are my bone and my flesh. And he stayed with him for a month. So this is, it's family. And it's also Middle Eastern hospitality, as we see how Abraham treated those men who came to him, which were the angels of God. But here also it's family. So he takes in his nephew and he stays with him. Then Laban said to Jacob, because you are my relative, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what should your wages be? So apparently we can infer that Jacob wasn't just a house guest, that he started probably helping around the farm and helping with the watering of the animals and whatever else was done. And so Laban says, hey, if you're gonna do that, I'll give you wages. Well, Jacob had a plan. Now Laban had 2 daughters, and the name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were delicate, but Rachel was beautiful of form and appearance. Now, notice that the Bible gives us some information because it's going to give you a little preview into what's going to happen later. So what do we mean? What does it mean? First of all, we know that, there's not just the one daughter, Rachel, whom he'd already met, but there are 2 daughters. And of the 2 daughters, how are they described? How are the 2 daughters described? We just read it. What do you see? Yours says weak eyes, okay? Anybody? Anything else? Any different? Tender eyes. Very good. And then how is the other one described? Beautiful. Not only just beautiful, but in form and appearance. So apparently she was beautiful. And so she really stood out. There's a contrast there. We don't actually know what the Bible means by delicate, tender, or weak eyes. But apparently there was something about the eyes that made her less attractive than the other one, than the sister. The sister was very beautiful, and in comparison, Leah wasn't. So maybe she had weak eyes. So she was the one, that had the big, thick glasses on. In our society, they didn't have glasses back then, but in our society, that's the way it would be, right? And so there's a distinction there. Verse 18, now Jacob loved Rachel. That's the one he saw, that's the one he met, that's the one he wanted. And so he loved Rachel, and he says, I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. So he said, what are your wages going to be? Jacob had a plan. He goes, I'm interested in your daughter. In fact, I will serve you for 7 years. Now, in the culture, whenever there's a marriage proposal, there is often what is a dowry involved. So even today, you still see that there's a dowry. It depends on the culture, which one gets the dowry, which one doesn't, and everything. So typically, what happens is that they'll bring gifts to the father and give him some gifts, and then the father winds up giving gifts that then go to the marriage couple, which is what we saw when Rebekah was sent down to Isaac. But remember, the servant had brought gifts to the father. So 7 years is a nice offer. 7 years of labor, that's more than any dowry it would be typical of the time. So it's a very generous offer. And Laban says, it's better that I give her to you than it should be to give her to another man. Stay with me. So he agrees. He says, yes, okay, we'll do that. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed but a few days to him because of the love that he had for her. Now, he's thinking, also this 7 years. Remember, how was life back home for Jacob? You think about, 7 years, that's a long courtship. That's a long time. Yet it says it's a short time for him, because not only did he really love this girl, but how was home life back home? Does anybody remember? Esau wanted to kill him. Remember that? He had essentially robbed Esau of his birthright. He had robbed Esau of his blessing from his father. I say robbed because he deceived. It was deception in each case, and asking for things that he didn't have a right to ask for. So life back home ain't so great. So 7 years here is just fine. And yet it goes by real quick. That's how it is all times whenever you're in love, right? When your eyes are sparkling with love, everything is just great, and boy, time flies. 7 years goes by, and in verse 22, after Jacob says, okay, give me my wife, Laban gathers together all the men in the place and made a feast. Now, don't think about this the way we do, as we have a wedding ceremony and it's all over in a day. These Middle Eastern cultures, it would last for a week or longer, and you see that in other places throughout Scripture. So they have this long feast. Now it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah, his daughter, and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. You might be thinking, well, man, didn't Jacob notice? Didn't he see what was happening? But apparently because of the culture, maybe the veil that she wore the whole time, kept her concealed. Whatever it was, number one, she was consenting to be a part of this plan that Laban had hatched. And apparently because of the culture and the way things work, it's dark now and you don't really see the person until the next day. And that's exactly what happened. So it came to pass, verse 25, in the morning, behold, it's Leah. How many of you would be surprised? Just think about you're going to marry your wife, the wife that you have, and you wake up the next morning and it ain't that woman. That would be a little shocking. And so he says to Laban, what is this that you've done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served you? Why have you, what are the words in your Bible there? Why have you deceived? What does Jacob's name mean? Deception. The deceiver has been deceived. You ever thought about that in this verse? Here the deceiver has been deceived. Now this doesn't by any means excuse what Laban did. And we got to remember, was God's hand involved in this? Absolutely. But the deceiver's been deceived. And then Laban says, it must not be done so in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Not really true. Might have some merit to, but that's just an excuse. He knows he's done something that's not right. And here's how you know it. He says, okay, fulfill her week, verse 27, and we will give you this one also for the service which you will serve with me still another 7 years. Wow, what a bargain. So here's this daughter. Thanks for the 7 years you've given me. And then he gets caught in this deception. He goes, okay, I tell you what, I'll go ahead and give you the other daughter, but you got to serve another 7 for her, because, this isn't 2 for 1, all right? And so, fulfill her week and still another 7 years. Then Jacob did so, fulfill her week, and so he gave him his daughter Rachel as wife also. And Laban gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as a maid. Then Jacob also went into Rachel, and he also loved Rachel more than Leah, and he served with Laban still another 7 years. Now, I don't know when the last time was that you read this story or how well you know this story, but how many of you have always thought or heard that Jacob served 7 years and then was deceived and wound up with Leah, and then he had to serve another 7 years before he got Rachel? Is that how some of y'all have heard this? 14 years before he got Rachel. Yeah, some of you, and that's me too. I've even remember thinking that's how it was. But notice what it says. It says, after the week, that ceremonial time with Leah, really unfair to Leah, then he gives Rachel also, and then he serves the 7 years. So he now has 2 wives, and by the way, 2 concubines also, which I know this whole thing is really weird, right? It's part of the culture. It's mass marriage instead of just one man, one woman, as God had said it's supposed to be and laid out the first marriage institution. But yet this is the culture, and we see this now where you have polygamy, you have multiple, as well as these servants that are given with the wife. Very interesting, different, strange for us kind of culture. But we have some strange things in our cultures too when it comes to marriage. So we have to be careful of passing too quick a judgment and just realize God has a way. That's the way it's supposed to be, and we'll go with that. All right. So that brings us now to the middle part, and really what should be the beginning of chapter 30. A lot of times the numbers and the chapter numbers that are put in our Bibles they make no rhyme or reason because somebody just put them in there randomly, but really this would be the beginning of chapter 30, because as you're going to see in just a moment, it all is connected. Verse 31, when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben. For she said, the Lord has surely looked on my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me. It's interesting. We now know a little bit more of the story. Jacob loves which one? Rachel. And it says that over and over, which naturally implies there's another one that he's married to her, but doesn't necessarily love her. And isn't it interesting that in this verse, God was good to Leah, even though her husband wasn't. God was good to Leah, even though her husband wasn't good to her. Because what does she want? What does she, it even uses Reuben, it says, now therefore my husband will what? Husbands, what is your responsibility, according to Ephesians chapter 5, towards your wives? Love. Husbands, love your wives. That is repeated over and over. Both Paul and Peter say that. Of course, God says that as well. Husbands are to love their wives. So apparently, Jacob was not fulfilling his duty. Yes, he was deceived. Yes, this is a weird family dynamic and situation, but she is still his wife. According to the customs of the land, he must love her, but apparently he didn't. So God loves her, or takes care of her, is good to her even when her husband isn't. Then she conceived again and bore a son. Says, I am unloved. He has therefore given me this son also, and she called his name Simeon. Simeon means hearing. She's saying, God hears me. She conceived again and bore a son, and now this time my husband will become attached to me. What does poor Leah want? She just wants her husband to show her that affection, to love her. Because I have borne him 3 sons, therefore his name shall be called Levi. And she conceived again and bore a son, and this time she says, now I will praise the Lord. Notice that her focus changes. Instead of saying, maybe now my husband will love me that I've given him a son. I've given him a second son. Maybe now he'll finally, connect with me. I give him a third son. And now on this 4th son, she says, I'm going to praise God. She recognizes this is a blessing from God. I'm going to give God the glory. And let's not forget, she is the first wife. Therefore, she is the woman of the house. So she has her rights. She has her authority within the house. Now, Rachel saw that verse 1 of chapter 30. See, here's why the chapter is connected. It starts back in chapter 29. Now, Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children. Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, give me children, lest that I die. And Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel, and he said, am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? Okay, whenever previous wife, I'm trying to remember if it was Sarah, I believe it was Rebecca who was barren. and I think it was Isaac. I could have it backward. It might be Sarah and Abraham, but she says, I don't have any children. He says, am I not better than 10 sons? Not the thing to say to your wife, men. Not the thing to say. Same here. You don't say, what, am I God? Am I supposed to give you children? Not the best thing to say to your wife. He should have been showing sympathy, showing something to her, but not that. And so what do we have here? There's a very interesting family dynamic that is going on. All this problem, all these issues, all started where? Why do we have this, what is now a conflict within this family? Where did it all start? What's your thoughts? Jacob and Laban, but in reality it started back with Jacob, didn't it? When he was deceiving his brother and everything else. So it's the old saying, you get, it's not karma, by the way. That is a superstition, that is a false belief. This is the result, these are called consequences of your actions. And God knows everything. And so we now have this dilemma within the family. So she thinks she's going to fix the problem. And this is, again, part cultural, also part human wisdom. And it's also, once again, life repeating itself as we see that Sarah tried to do the same thing with Abraham. So now we have Rachel. She says, here's my maid, Bilhah. Go into her, and she will bear a child on my knees that I may have children. And this is part of it. She is a subservient to Rachel. Therefore, according to the culture, these will be her children, even though this other woman is going to be given, kind of like a surrogate mother, you might say. And she gave him Bilhah, her maid as wife, and Jacob went into her, and Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, God has judged my case, and he's also heard my voice and given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan. Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, with great wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed. So she called his name Naphtali. Now it's interesting, she uses the word wrestle because later on in the story we know that Jacob is going to wind up doing some wrestling himself. So we'll continue with this chapter in just a second, but here's an overall view of what's happening. So we have Abraham who has 2 wives, really 3 wives, and you see those descendants, and through Sarah comes the promised son, Isaac, and Isaac, Rebekah have Jacob and Esau. Esau, we'll look at him later. He's got his whole lineage. But then now we have Jacob, and we see Jacob with these 4 wives and begins to have these children. And so here you can kind of see that all of the children, let me zoom in. There we go. That way you can see what's happening and kind of get a good idea of the connections with all these that we're reading here. So far we have several children born to Leah, and now several children born to Bilhah, who is the servant of Rachel. When Leah, verse 9, saw that she had stopped bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her to Jacob's wife. So, hey, good for the goose, good for the gander, right? We're going to do the same thing she did. If she can do it, I can do it. So here's my maid. Again, this all sounds weird to us. It's like, man, this would be some kind of reality TV, wouldn't it? Wow. And all kinds of dynamics happening and conflict and everything else. So Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Leah said, a troop comes. So his name is Gad. Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. And Leah said, I am happy, for the daughters will call me blessed. So she called his name Asher. So Leah's whole attitude begins to change as she's now focused more on God and sees the promises of God working through her as well. Now Reuben went into the days of harvest and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. And she said to her, is it a small matter you would take away my husband? You'll take away my son's mandrakes also? Okay, I said Leah was happy, but is Leah carrying a grudge? Wow. So Rachel said, therefore, he will lie with you tonight, talking about Jacob, and for your son's mandrakes. It's like, fine. Okay, so they're bartering with their husband. And I'll let you draw the conclusions of what they're bartering for. So God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, God has given me my hire because I have given my maid to my husband. So she called his name Issachar. And then Leah conceived again, and a sixth son, and she called his name Zebulun. And afterwards she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. And that story is going to come into play a little later. Then God remembered Rachel. So after all this time, and the last one, Rachel, and he listened to her, and he opened her room, and she conceived and bore a son, and said, God has taken away my reproach. Now, why would she say, God has taken away my reproach? What is so reproachable about not having children? Does anybody know?
It's her attitude toward Leah.
Nice. Her attitude towards Leah is one reason. Why else is it a reproach? That's correct, by the way. There's more to it. Because in that day and age, in that culture, it was considered, women, unfortunately, were looked at almost as property. And their main function was to give children. Again, I know that sounds harsh. It sounds weird in our own culture. But we're just talking about ancient Bible cultures. And so it's reproachable for her to not have children. It means that in their eyes, she looks at herself as if she's worthless. And so God has taken away the reproach, partly because of her attitude, as was said, but then also because of culture. So she called his name Joseph, and the Lord added a son. All right, so here you can see all of the descendants of Jacob through his 4 wives, we'll say. These are where the names come from. These children are where the names come from of what will be the 12 tribes of Israel whenever the nation grows into Israel. And of course, there's also a little bit of changes in that because there's not a tribe called Joseph. There should be one tribe called Joseph in there, but that doesn't happen because he winds up having 2 sons, and those 2 names wind up being part of the 12 tribes. Yes? Would this not be part of the plan?
Had to get something going here.
You're exactly right. Would this not be part of God's plan? It absolutely is. So it shows us that all of the little maneuvering and everything else up to this point, what's been happening. You have Jacob, who has been a deceiver, let's back up a little bit more. You have Sarah, who tried to manipulate things or try to help God a little bit. That didn't go so well. We stick with God's plan and his timing. And then now we have Jacob, who between him and Rebekah trying to help God along or something, and yet God's plan always works. Then you wind up with Laban and his deception and manipulating things and everything. And now, once again, it all comes back to God. We're going to see in a couple more chapters whenever Jacob finally wakes up and realizes, oh, I should have listened to you from the beginning. But up to this point, this is one of the beautiful things about the Bible. In this story that is so well known, one of the things that we learn is, number one, God's way works and God's way will always work. And it's going to work because nothing can frustrate the plans of God. But that doesn't mean that there won't be consequences for actions that we take sometimes when we don't listen to God. So there's a whole lot of lessons that we can draw from this as we see. For example, here's another thing. Think about the 2 women. Leah, all she wants is she's saying, if my husband would just love me and if I have children, if I get this right. All right, here it is. She's thinking, if I just had beauty, then my husband would love me and I would be happy. Right? And then you have Rachel who's saying, if I just had children, then my husband would love me and I would be happy. We need to be careful of looking and comparing ourselves to others. How many of you were here Wednesday night for Jason's lesson? Wasn't that great? Talking about not comparing yourself to others. That we get ourselves into sin whenever we do that. Does God love you the way you are? Do this. Yes, God loves you just the way you are. You do not have to be like somebody else. You do not have to have something else in order for God to love you more. So be careful about looking for worldly happiness. Doesn't mean God doesn't want you to be happy in this world. We just got to be careful about our definitions of what makes us happy. We need to keep our eyes on God. Leah is beginning to see that. She's beginning to realize the focus has been wrong the whole time. I need to focus on God. Jacob's not quite there yet, but he will be in another chapter or two. And Laban never gets there because he winds up going back to his false idols. So those are some great lessons to help us understand not only are these real people and real life events and things happening, but it shows us the Bible gives us real things that we can relate to and draw from to help us in our own lives. Any questions, comments up to this point?
I have a comment.
Yes.
So I thought it was interesting that Laban and, of course, Rebekah are brother and sister.
Yes.
And I thought Rebekah helped to deceive Isaac and how she, encouraged Jacob to
Yes.
deceive Isaac. And then Laban deceives Jacob. And when Jacob decides that he's going to leave the service of Laban, there is another big deception.
That's right.
And that turns into a different story. So were people more clever in those days? Did they deal with each other in a different way? Because there's a lot of that goes on in the Bible.
Yes. And it still goes on today. Yeah. And so a great point brought out the fact that so you have Laban and Rebekah, brother and sister, and it's Rebekah who is involved in some deception and everything with Jacob, then sends Jacob to Laban, and then Laban winds up deceiving Jacob, and Jacob's name is deceiver and has done that himself. There's a whole lot of deception going on, and the question were people just more,
They were just more clever.
Were they just more clever and conniving back then? And cunning? Again, a great lesson that we can draw out of this, because are people still that way today? And so that's what winds up happening in here. In fact, there's one part in my notes as we get into whenever you see this other conflict that's going to happen in the next chapter, whenever Laban and Jacob, it's interesting. It's like you can't con a con man, right? Because they know, by this point, they know each other's cons, and so they finally have an agreement. Yes, I saw a hand go up back here.
It shows that God can work around man's free will.
Oh, yes, exactly. God can work around man's free will. So while we have free will, that's what I said a minute ago, God's will always be done. And doesn't that give you comfort? It does me, and I'm very thankful for it. If I'm not mistaken, that's the first bell. So we got 5 minutes to go through about 12 chapters. So here we go. All right. So in the next part of this, beginning in verse 25, Jacob says, "Send me away that I may go back to my own place in my own country." So even though all this was happening, Jacob still knew God's plan, and Jacob still knew where he belonged. Because what did God say to Abraham in the beginning? "I will make your descendants as numerous as the sands and the stars, and I will give you this land." He knows that. That's from his grandfather. So he knows where he's supposed to be. And I believe that's another lesson we can take. I believe every human being on the face of the planet, within them, knows that they're supposed to be doing God's will. We know what is right and wrong. Yes, there's some evil people in this world, and yes, they do some things you think they have no inkling of what good is. But God gives us free will, and within that, He gives us also the opportunity to find Him. And knowing His will is the most important thing in our lives. Because what was mankind created for? Let us hear the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep His commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. In other words, this is what man was created for. This is what he's all about. Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 13. So he says, let me go back. And Laban acknowledges, the Lord has blessed me for your sake. And so they work out a deal for he can go and work the sheep and everything. And then in verses 36 down forward, you see this. He's using these trees that he's cut, and it causes the sheep to conceive. And so we have no idea what that's all about. It may have been an ancient custom. Maybe Jacob knows more about animal husbandry than we do. But whatever it was, God's hand was in it, and He blesses him richly. And in chapter 31, the sons begin to see what's going on. They say, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has acquired all this wealth. Verse 2, and Jacob saw the countenance of Laban, and indeed it was not favorable towards him. So the Lord, verse 3, said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred. So then he goes to his wives and he says, you know that I have worked for your dad. You know that all that I have here is because I have worked. You also know that your dad has deceived me. You also know all these things. You know that he's changed my wages 10 times in those 14 years, more than 14 now. So they say, hey, we're your wives. Do as the Lord tells you. So they agree and they go. But there's one little problem. Verse 19. Now Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the household idols that were her father's. That tells us something about idolatry. If you can steal a god and take it from somebody else, it's not much of a god, first of all. But why did she do that? There's lots of thoughts. We don't know exactly why. One is that maybe she worshiped the idols. I don't think she did, because she would have known the religion and the beliefs of Jacob and seen God working. She does believe in God. Maybe she wants to get even with her dad. After all, remember the deception that took place. Maybe this is her way of getting back at him. Maybe those little idols had something to do with the dowry or the deed of the land and the property or something. Or maybe she didn't want Laban to have them or to go appeal to them if it's going to hinder their returning. Whatever the reason, we don't know. But they wind up leaving. Laban finds out. He pursues them. And then he comes to them and he gets very angry. And he says, it's in my power to do you harm. You've stolen away my daughters and all my property. Quick question before we close. Who did the daughters and the property actually belong to? Jacob. I mean, God said that, right? A man shall leave his mother and father, same to the woman, and shall be joined to their spouse, and the two shall become one. No longer part of that original family, but Laban's of the mindset, those are my daughters, that's my property, what have you done? Great point to stop. Stay tuned, because it just gets better. We'll start next week. Thank you for your attention. We're going to prepare for our worship.